Part 3, Taking Back Hinduism. 7. Taking back Hinduism. If Hindutva is resisted by the vast majority of liberal Hindus, it is hardly paradoxical to suggest that Hinduism, India's ancient homegrown faith, can help strengthen Indianness in ways that the proponents of Hindutva have not understood. In one sense, Hinduism is almost the ideal faith for the 21st century, a faith without apostasy, where there are no heretics to cast out because there has never been any such thing as a Hindu heresy. A faith that is eclectic and non-doctrinaire responds ideally to the incertitudes of a postmodern world. So it was hard for a Hindu, proud of his faiths and his country's liberal traditions, not to be mortified, in 2015, when the visiting U.S. President, Barack Obama, felt obliged to deliver a speech in New Delhi urging the government to live up to India's own values, and did it again in a post-presidential visit in 2017. India will succeed so long as it is not split along the lines of religious faith, Mr. Obama said in 2015 in an implicit rebuke to the Hindutva brigades. The president was, of course, polite, couching his praise of religious diversity as a mutual strength of both India and the US, and speaking of his own challenges as a politician with the middle name of Hussein in a country increasingly hostile to Muslims. Many Obama critics in the US had alleged that he is a Muslim, not a Christian, the president acknowledged. There have been times when my faith has been questioned by people who don't know me. They said that I adhered to a different religion, as if that were somehow a bad thing, he said. Point 1. The president could hardly have been unaware, of course, that India's Hindutva-leaning prime minister had had a long track record of implying that belonging to a different religion than his own is indeed a bad thing, and that he depends for his political success on the support of people who have variously wanted all non-Hindus to convert back to the mother faith or be driven out of the country. And he did it again on a visit to New Delhi in December 2017. A country shouldn't be divided into sectarian lines, and that is something I have told Prime Minister Modi in person as well as to people in America, Obama declared. For a country like India, where there is a Muslim population that is successful, integrated and considers itself as Indian, which is not the case in some other countries, this should be nourished and cultivated. Obama's message on both occasions was pointed. If India did not resolve the problems of bigotry that are dividing the country, Mr. Modi's proclaimed ambitious development plans would be thwarted. It was a message many of us in the political opposition had also been giving Mr. Modi and his colleagues. But coming from a U.S. president, whose visit was being hailed by the government as a diplomatic triumph and whose bromance with the Indian PM had seen first names being used and much friendly banter, it was a pointed reminder of the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Modi's regime. As I had spelled out in my 2014 book India Shastra, Mr. Modi's speeches and rhetoric appeared to recognize, and harness, a vital shift in our national politics from a politics of identity to a politics of performance, yet he had risen to power at the helm of a party, the BJP, which is ill-suited to the challenge of delinking India's polity from the incendiary issue of religious identity on which it had built its base. Of course, Indians don't need an American visitor to tell them to uphold the ideal of freedom of religion. When our history is one of coexistence, the acceptance of religious diversity is deeply embedded in our culture, and our Constitution reflects our pluralism. It's a great pity that a foreign leader is obliged to recognize that some Indians do not share the values on which India is built and which are reified in our Constitution. As I have long argued, Indian democracy is all about the management of diversity, and if we don't respect our diversity, we will no longer be the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free. But for the first time, India has elected a prime minister who was himself named for severe violations of religious freedom in reports by the U.S. State Department from 2002 onwards, refused an American visa and was banned from entering the United States before he became prime minister. Mr. Modi wasn't elected PM for condoning violence against minorities, but to fulfill an aspirational development vision he effectively articulated. Mr. Obama's speech was a way of telling him he can't do that without abandoning his old religious intolerance that earned him those American strictures. The problem is that the dominant strand in the ruling party cares far more about asserting Hindu chauvinism than it does about the economic reforms and investments that Mr. Modi trumpeted and which won him the support of voters who did not share his Hindutva agenda. A party dependent on people who urge Hindu women to have 4 children, no, 10, as the Shankaracharya of Bhadrakashram said, not only shows profound disrespect to Hindu women too, who have to endure the labor to fulfill the Hindutva Brigade's political fantasies, but proves itself out of touch with the real values and priorities of the Hindu masses in whose name it claims to speak. The fact remains that the Modi regime has given free rein to the most retrograde elements in Indian society, who are busy rewriting textbooks to glorify Hindu leaders, extolling the virtues of ancient science over modern technology, beating the drums over love jihad, extolling Gar Wapsi, and asserting that India's identity must be purely Hindu. Majoritarian communalism, as Nehru had long recognized, is a fundamental threat to our pluralist democracy. But throughout his life as an RSS pracharak, Modi has devoted himself to the very worldview that is undermining India's harmony, tolerance and acceptance. As a believing Hindu, I cannot agree with the followers of Hindutva. Indeed, I am ashamed of what they are doing while claiming to be acting in the name of my faith. The violence is particularly sickening. It has led hundreds of thousands of Hindus across India to protest with placards screaming, "Not in my name." As I have explained throughout this book, and would like to reiterate, I have always prided myself on belonging to a religion of astonishing breadth and range of belief, a religion that acknowledges all ways of worshipping God as equally valid, indeed, the only major religion in the world that does not claim to be the only true religion. As I have often asked, how dare a bunch of thugs shrink the soaring majesty of the Vedas and the Upanishads to the petty bigotry of their brand of identity politics? Why should any Hindu allow them to diminish Hinduism to the raucous self-glorification of the football hooligan, to take a religion of awe-inspiring tolerance and reduce it to a chauvinist rampage? Hinduism, with its openness, its respect for variety, its acceptance of all other faiths, is one religion which has always been able to assert itself without threatening others. But this is not the Hindutva that destroyed the Babri Masjid, nor that is spewed in hate-filled diatribes by communal politicians. It is, instead, the Hinduism of Swami Vivekananda, whom I have quoted at such length in this book. It is important to parse some of Swami Vivekananda's most significant assertions. The first is his assertion that Hinduism stands for both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. He had quoted a hymn I have already cited, to the effect that as different streams originating in different places all flow into the same sea, so do all paths lead to the same divinity. He repeatedly asserted the wisdom of the Advaita belief that truth is one even if the sages call it by different names. Vivekananda's vision summarized in the Credo Sarva Dharma Samhava is, in fact, the kind of Hinduism practiced by the vast majority of Hindus, whose instinctive acceptance of other faiths and forms of worship has long been the vital hallmark of our culture. Of course, it is true that, while Hinduism as a faith might privilege tolerance, this does not necessarily mean that all Hindus behave tolerantly. Nor should we assume that, even when religion is used as a mobilizing identity, all those so mobilized act in accordance with the tenets of their religion. Nonetheless, it is ironic that even the Maratha warrior King Shivaji, after whom the bigoted Shiv Sena is named, exemplified the Hindu respect for other faiths. In the account of a critic, the Mughal historian Kaifi Khan, Shivaji made it a rule that his followers should do no harm to mosques, the Quran, or to women. Whenever a copy of the sacred Quran came into his hands, Kaifi Khan wrote, Shivaji treated it with respect, and gave it to some of his Musalman followers. 3 Other sources confirm Shivaji's standing orders to his troops that if they came across a Quran or a Bible they should preserve it safely until it could be passed on to a Muslim or Christian. It is this doctrine of universal acceptance that has been increasingly called into question by the acolytes of Hindutva. Vivekananda had given his fellow Hindus a character certificate many of them no longer deserve. The Hindus have their faults, Vivekananda added, but they are always for punishing their own bodies, and never for cutting the throats of their neighbors. If the Hindu fanatic burns himself on the pyre, he never lights the fire of inquisition, for these words have a tragic echo 125 years later in an India in which Hindu fanaticism is rising, and adopting a form that Vivekananda would not have recognized as Hindu. The economist Amartya Sen made a related point in regretting the neglect by the votaries of Hindutva of the great achievements of Hindu civilization in favor of its more dubious features. As Sen wrote about Hindu militants, not for them the sophistication of the Upanishads or Gita, or of Brahmagupta or Sankara, or of Kalidasa or Sudraka, they prefer the adoration of Rama's idol and Hanuman's image. Their nationalism also ignores the rationalist traditions of India, a country in which some of the earliest steps in algebra, geometry, and astronomy were taken, where the decimal system emerged, where early philosophy, secular as well as religious, achieved exceptional sophistication, where people invented games like chess, pioneered sex education, and began the first systematic study of political economy. The Hindu militant chooses instead to present India explicitly or implicitly as a country of unquestioning idolaters, delirious fanatics, belligerent devotees, and religious murderers. 5. To discriminate against another, to attack another, to kill another, to destroy another's place of worship, is not part of the Hindu Dharma so magnificently preached by Vivekananda, nor the Hinduism propagated in 21st century India by popular spiritual leaders like Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, founder of the Art of Living, and Sadhguru Jagai Vasudev, founder of the Isha Ashram, who preach a humane, practical faith using techniques of meditation and yoga as well as spiritual advice anchored in the ancient texts. Why, then, are the voices of Hindu religious leaders not being raised in defense of these fundamentals of Hinduism against those who would violently pervert it? I reject the presumption that the purveyors of hatred speak for all or even most Hindus. The Hindutva ideology is in fact a malign distortion of Hinduism. It is striking that leaders of now-defunct 20th century political parties like the Liberal Party and the pro-free enterprise Svatantra Party were unabashed in their avowal of their Hinduism, the liberal leader Srinivasa Sastry wrote learned disquisitions on the Ramayana, and the founder of Svatantra, C. Rajagopalachari, Rajaji, was a Sanskrit scholar whose translations of the Itihasas and lectures on aspects of Hinduism are still widely read, decades after his death. Neither would have recognized the intolerance and bigotry of Hindutva as in any way representative of the faith they held dear. Many leaders in the Congress Party are similarly comfortable in their Hindu beliefs while rejecting the political construct of Hindutva. It suits the purveyors of Hindutva to imply that the choice is between their belligerent interpretation of Hinduism and the godless westernization of the pseudo-seculars. Rajaji and Sastry proved that you could wear your Hinduism on your sleeve and still be a political liberal. But that choice is elided by the identification of Hindutva with political Hinduism, as if such a conflation is the only possible approach open to practicing Hindus. I reject that idea. I not only consider myself both a Hindu and a liberal, but find that liberalism is the political ideology that most corresponds to the wide-ranging and open-minded nature of my faith, a reflection of insecurity. The irony is that Hindutva reassertion is a reflection of insecurity rather than self-confidence. It is built on constant reminders of humiliation and defeat, sustained by tales of Muslim conquest and rule, stoked by stories of destroyed temples and looted treasures, all of which have imprisoned susceptible Hindus in a narrative of victimhood. Hindutva is an answer to a perception of failure and defeat, rather than a broad-minded story of a confident faith finding its place in the world. Looking back towards the failures of the past, it offers no hopes for the successes of the future. This seems to be conceded even by one of the foremost voices of contemporary Hindutva, the American David Frawley. Hindus, he writes in his foundational screed Arise Arjuna, 1995, are generally suffering from a lack of self-esteem and an inferiority complex by which they are afraid to really express themselves or their religion. They have been beaten down by centuries of foreign rule and ongoing attempts to convert them. Frawley's answer is for Indians to reassert Hindu pride, but his diagnosis calls that prescription into question. As a Hindu and an Indian, I would argue that the whole point about India is the rejection of the idea that religion should be a determinant of nationhood. Our nationalist leaders did not jump to the conclusion that a partition-formed Muslim state dictated an equivalent one for Hindus. To accept the idea of India, you have to spurn the logic that divided the country in 1947. Your Indianness has nothing to do with which God you choose to worship, or not. We are not going to reduce ourselves to a Hindu Pakistan. That is the real problem here. As I have mentioned earlier, Nehru had warned that the communalism of the majority was especially dangerous because it could present itself as nationalist. Yet, Hindu nationalism is not Indian nationalism. And it has nothing to do with genuine Hinduism either. I too am proud of my Hinduism. I do not want to cede its verities to fanatics. I consider myself a Hindu and a nationalist, but I am not a Hindu nationalist. To discriminate against another, to attack another, to kill another, to destroy another's place of worship, on the basis of his faith is not part of Hindu Dharma, as it was not part of Swami Vivekananda's. It is time to go back to these fundamentals of Hinduism. It is time to rescue Hindu Dharma from the fundamentalists. The misuse of Hinduism for sectarian minority bashing is especially sad since Hinduism provides the basis for a shared sense of common culture within India that has little to do with religion. Best-selling authors like Amish Tripathi have achieved spectacular success by reinventing characters from Hindu mythology and the epics in stories accessible to modern readers, without surrendering to the prevalent chauvinism and bigotry of the Hindutva assertion. Hindu festivals, from Holi to Diwali and of course Kerala's Onam, have already gone beyond their religious origins to unite Indians of all faiths as a shared experience. The revelry of Holi, the celebratory gift-giving of Onam, and the lights, firecrackers, Mithais and social gambling of Diwali, have made all three into secular occasions. Festivals, utsavas, melas, leelas, all Hindu in origin, have become occasions for the mingling of ordinary Indians of all backgrounds. Religion lies at the heart of Indian culture, but not necessarily as a source of division. Religious myths like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata provide a common idiom, a shared matrix of reference, to all Indians, and it was not surprising that when Doordarshan broadcast a 52-episode serialization of the Mahabharata, the script was written by a Muslim, Dr. Rahim Asum Rasa. Hinduism and Islam are intertwined in India. Both religions, after all, have shared the same history in the same space, and theirs is a cohabitation of necessity as well as fact. To some degree, India's other minorities have found it comfortable to take on elements of Hindu culture as proof of their own integration into the national mainstream. The tennis-playing brothers Anand, Vijay, and Ashok Amritraj all bear Hindu names, but they are Christian, the sons of Robert and Maggie Amritraj, and they played with prominent crosses dangling from their necks, which they were fond of kissing in supplication or gratitude at tense moments on court. But giving their children Hindu names must have seemed, to Robert and Maggie, more nationalist in these post-colonial times, and quite unrelated to which god they were brought up to worship. I would not wish to make too much of this, because Muslim Indians still feel obliged to adopt Arab names in deference to the roots of their faith, but the Amritraj case, repeated in many other Christian families I know, is merely an example of Hinduism serving as a framework for the voluntary cultural assimilation of minority groups, without either compulsion or conversion becoming an issue. Keralites almost unanimously consider the Christian singer Yesudas, whose very name is derived from Jesus, to be the greatest ever singer of Malayalam devotional songs and bhajans. For decades his songs were played at and around the Guruvayur temple while, as a Christian, the singer himself was not allowed in. In September 2017 it was, however, announced that were he to make a formal request, he would be permitted entry as a confirmed bhakt of Lord Krishna. Hinduism as culture. It is to a great degree possible to speak of Hinduism as culture rather than as religion, a distinction the votaries of Hindutva distort in extolling Savarkar's enunciation of a similar view. The inauguration of a public project, the laying of a foundation stone or the launching of a ship usually start with the ritual smashing of a coconut, an auspicious practice in Hinduism but one which most Indians of other faiths cheerfully accept in much the same spirit as teetotalers acknowledge the role of champagne in a Western celebration. Interestingly, similar Hindu customs have survived in now Muslim Java and now Buddhist Thailand. Islamic Indonesians still cherish the Ramayana legend, now shorn, for them, of its religious associations. Javanese Muslims bear Sanskrit names. Hindu culture can easily be embraced by non-Hindus if it is separated from religious faith and treated as a heritage to which all may lay claim. I have often argued that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana should be taught in our schools just as the Odyssey and the Iliad are in Western ones, not as religious texts but as towering accomplishments of our culture and the source of so many legends and cultural references. Amartya Sen is right to stress that Hinduism is not simply the Hindutva of Ayodhya or Gujarat. It has left all Indians a religious, philosophical, spiritual, and historical legacy that gives meaning to the civilizational content of secular Indian nationalism. In building an Indian nation that takes account of the country's true Hindu heritage, we have to return to the pluralism of the national movement. This must involve turning away from the strident calls for Hindutva that would privilege a doctrinaire view of Hinduism at the expense of the minorities, because such calls are a denial of the essence of the Hinduism of Vivekananda. I say this not as a godless secularist, but as a proud Hindu who is mortified at what his own faith is being reduced to in the hands of bigots, petty men who know little about the beliefs, the traditions, and the history of the faith in whose defense they claim to act. They have distorted a pluralist religious philosophy in the process of instrumentalizing it as a political ideology. The way in which history and cultural memory informs contemporary attitudes varies from family to family. My mother's prosperous Nair family in Palakkad, for instance, lived in mortal terror of imminent attack by Tipu Sultan and lost most of its wealth in a foolish attempt to protect it from him by burying their treasures in an unknown location. They never found them again. But despite the stories that have been wryly and ruefully told and retold and passed down the generations over the 2 centuries since, my family and I never extended our dislike of Tipu and his marauders to a rejection of Muslims as a whole, and certainly not to any Muslims of today. While we have no illusions about past attacks on temples by Muslim raiders, we did not bring up our children to use the past to justify bigotry in the present. One can appreciate history and leave it where it belongs. Indians today have to find real answers to the dilemmas of running a plural nation. Nationalists often define their nation in terms of a cohesive group of people, held together by a common enemy. The common enemy of Indians is an internal one, but not the one identified by the Hindutva fanatics and their ilk. The common enemy lies in the forces of sectarian division that would, if unchecked, tear the country apart or transform it into something that most self-respecting Hindus would refuse to recognize. In many ways, the fundamental conflict of our times is the clash between, not civilizations, but doctrines, religious and ethnic fundamentalism on the one hand, secular consumerist capitalism on the other. The clash is taking place amidst a paradox. Thanks to globalization, the world has been coming together into a single international market, just as it is simultaneously being torn apart by civil war, terrorism, and the breakup of nations. Today there is a backlash, or more accurately 2 kinds of backlash, one a widely noted current of economic anti-globalization, as the losers rebel against the elites who have been exporting their jobs to faraway lands, and the other what one can call cultural anti-globalization, whose proponents seek the comforts of traditional identity. In many places in the West the 2 backlashes overlap, but in a country like India they do not. India's government seeks to be part of globalization while rejecting the cultural diversity it implies. The Hindutva movement in India is part of this latter backlash against cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, and secularism in the name of cultural rootedness, religious or ethnic identity, and nationalist authenticity. In India, this claim to authenticity and rootedness has taken on a majoritarian Hindu coloring under the BJP. It has sought to reduce Indians to a singular identity framed around their religious affiliation. Each individual, as I pointed out in my 1997 book India, From Midnight to the Millennium, has many identities. Sometimes religion obliges us to deny the truth about our own complexity by obliterating the multiplicity inherent in our identities. Religious fundamentalism, in particular, does so because it embodies a passion for pure belonging, a yearning intensified by the threatening tidal wave of globalization as well as by the specificities of the devotee's politics. And it feeds on the inevitable sense among its adherents of being wounded, whether real or imagined. In this way, Hindutva reassertion draws from the same well springs as Islamist fanaticism and white nationalist Christian fundamentalism. What is to be done? We cannot delegitimize religion, and indeed there is something precious and valuable in a faith that allows a human being to see himself at one with others stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from identity? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong? If we want religion to stop feeding fanaticism, terror, and ethnic wars, we must find other ways of satisfying the need for identity. If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we might still escape the worst horrors that the doomsayers, like Samuel Huntington, who 2 decades ago foretold a clash of civilizations, can conceive. A domestic clash of civilizations would destroy India, which has survived and thrived as a civilizational medley. Thanks, in many ways, to the eclectic inclusiveness of Hinduism, everything in India exists in countless variants. There was no single standard, no fixed stereotype, no one way. This pluralism emerged from the very nature of the country. It was made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by its history. There was simply too much of both to permit a single, exclusionist nationalism. When Hindutva's cotters demanded that all Indians declare Bharat Mata Ki Jai, victory to Holy Mother India, as a litmus test of their nationalism, many of us insisted that no Indian should be obliged to mouth the slogan he did not believe in his heart. If some Muslims, for instance, felt that their religion did not allow them to hail their motherland as a goddess, the Constitution of India gave them the right not to. Hindutva wrongly seeks to deny them this right. We were brought up to take this for granted, and to reject the sectarianism that had partitioned the nation when the British left. I was raised unaware of my own caste and unconscious of the religious loyalties of my schoolmates and friends. Of course, knowledge of these details came in time, but too late for any of it to matter, even less to influence my attitude or conduct. We were Indians. We were brought up, and constantly exhorted, to believe in an idea of nationhood transcending communal divisions. This may sound like the lofty obliviousness of the privileged, but such beliefs were held not only by elites, they were a reflection of how most Indians lived, even in the villages. Independent India was born out of a nationalist struggle in which acceptance of each other, which we, perhaps unwisely, called secularism, was fundamental to the nationalist consensus. It is true that Hindu zealotry, which ought to be a contradiction in terms, is partly a reaction to other chauvinisms. As I have pointed out, the unreflective avowal by many Hindus of their own secularism has provoked the scorn of some Hindus, who despise the secularists as deracinated Macaulay Putras, sons of Macaulay, or Babur K. Aulad, sons of Babur. They see such Hindus as cut off from their own culture and heritage, and challenge them to rediscover their authentic roots, as defined by the proponents of Hindutva. Hinduism is not a monolith. But Hinduism is no monolith. Its strength is found within each Hindu, not in the collectivity. Defining a Hindu cause may well be a political reaction to the definition of non-Hindu causes. The Hindutva idea originated around the same time as the rise of a separate Muslim consciousness in the polity in the early 20th century, and the resentments that spilled over into the destruction of the Babri Masjid in the century's last decade were largely articulated in opposition to the imagined appeasement of India's minorities. The rage of the Hindu mobs is that of those who feel themselves supplanted in this competition of identities, who think that they are taking their country back from usurpers of long ago. They want revenge against history, but they do not realize that history is its own revenge. The Hindutva fanatics seek to reinvent Hindu identity with a new belief structure and a new vocabulary. They seek to make Hinduism more like the Semitic religions they resent but wish to emulate, to pick fewer sacred books, notably the Gita, and exalt them would produce a less baggy, tighter version of the faith, to focus on fewer gods, notably Shiva, Rama and Krishna, with Ganesh and various forms of Devi thrown in, would sharpen Hindu divinity, to standardize religious practices around specific familiar festivals, rituals, and gatherings, would provide a greater sense of community. Their associated efforts include a desire to control and restrict what Hindus eat, so their rejection of beef, even though several castes did eat it in the past, would itself become a marker of identity, to promote Hindi as a national language, though it is quite foreign to nearly half the country, so as to ensure that the vocabulary of Hindutvam can be more easily transmitted, to mouth the same slogans, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and chant the same songs. Vande Mataram is a must, even though some Muslims are uncomfortable with both, in order to promote conformity. This invented Hinduism has much more to do with an era of political and cultural insecurity and a faltering new sense of aspiration than with the Vedas, the Puranas, or the Bhakti movement. It denies the lived history of Hinduism even while claiming to speak in its name. The central challenge of India is the challenge of accommodating the aspirations of different groups in the national dream. The ethos of Hinduism, inclusionist, flexible, agglomerative, helped the nation meet this challenge. The doctrine of Hindutva prefers uniformity to accommodation. The struggle for India's soul will be between two Hinduisms, the secularist Indianism of the nationalist movement and the particularist fanaticism of the Ayodhya mob. It is a battle that rages still. The inevitable backlash to my writings about Hindutva excesses, from the Babri Masjid demolition to the Gujarat horrors, has largely taken the form of belligerent emails and assorted social media fulminations from the less reflective of the Hindutva brigade. I have been excoriated as anti-Hindu and described by several as a well-known leftist, which will no doubt amuse those of my friends who knew me in college 30 years ago as one of the very few supporters of Rajaji's conservative Svatantra party in those consensually socialist times. And from time to time a Hindutvavadai, reminding me of the religion that has been mine from birth, succumbed to the temptation to urge me predictably to heed that well-worn slogan, Garv se ho ki hum Hindu hain, say with pride that we are Hindus. All right, let us take him up on that. I am indeed proud that I am a Hindu. But of what is it that I am, and am not, proud? I am not proud of my co-religionists attacking and destroying Muslim homes and shops. I am not proud of Hindus raping Muslim girls, or slitting the wombs of Muslim mothers. I am not proud of Hindu vegetarians who have roasted human beings alive and rejoiced over the corpses. I am not proud of those who reduce the lofty metaphysical speculations of the Upanishads to the petty bigotry of their own sense of identity, which they assert in order to exclude, not embrace, others. I am proud that India's pluralism is paradoxically sustained by the fact that the overwhelming majority of Indians are Hindus, because Hinduism has taught them to live amidst a variety of other identities. I am proud of those Hindus, like the Shankaracharya of Kangchi, who say that Hindus and Muslims must live like Ram and Lakshman in India. I am not proud of those Hindus, like Sadhvi Raithamhara, who say that Muslims are like sour lemons curdling the milk of Hindu India. I am not proud of those who suggest that only a Hindu, and only a certain kind of Hindu, can be an authentic Indian. I am not proud of those Hindus who say that people of other religions live in India only on their sufferance, and not because they belong on our soil. I am proud of those Hindus who realize that an India that denies itself to some of us could end up being denied to all of us. I am proud of those Hindus who utterly reject Hindu communalism, conscious that the communalism of the majority is especially dangerous because it can present itself as nationalist. I am proud of those Hindus who respect the distinction between Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism. Obviously, majorities are never seen as separatist, since separatism is by definition pursued by a minority. But majority communalism is in fact an extreme form of separatism, because it seeks to separate other Indians, integral parts of our country, from India itself. I am proud of those Hindus who recognize that the saffron and the green both belong equally on the Indian flag. The reduction of non-Hindus to second-class status in their own homeland is unthinkable. As I have pointed out here, and elsewhere, it would be a second partition, and a partition in the Indian soul would be as bad as a partition in the Indian soil. For Hindus like myself, the only possible idea of India is that of a nation greater than the sum of its parts. That is the only India that will allow us to call ourselves not Brahmins, not Bengalis, not Hindus, not Hindi speakers, but simply Indians. How about another slogan for Hindus like me? Garv se keho ki hum Indian hain, say with pride that we are Indian. There is an old Puranic story about truth. It seems a brash young warrior sought the hand of a beautiful princess. Her father, the king, thought he was a bit too cocksure and callow. He decreed that the warrior could only marry the princess after he had found truth. So the warrior set out into the world on a quest for truth. He went to temples and monasteries, to mountain tops where sages meditated, to remote forests where ascetics scourged themselves, but nowhere could he find truth. Despairing one day and seeking shelter from a thunderstorm, he took refuge in a musty cave. There was an old crone there, a hag with matted hair and warts on her face, the skin hanging loose from her bony limbs, her teeth yellow and rotting, her breath malodorous. But as he spoke to her, with each question she answered, he realized he had come to the end of his journey. She was truth. They spoke all night, and when the storm cleared, the warrior told her he had fulfilled his quest. Armed with his knowledge of truth, he could go back to the palace and claim his bride. Now that I have found truth, he said, what shall I tell them at the palace about you? The wizened old creature smiled. Tell them, she said, tell them that I am young and beautiful. So truth exists, but is not always true. That subtle insight is typical of the wisdom of the ancient Hindus. It gives the light to the petty bigotries, the glib certitudes, the righteous fanaticism of those who advocate Hindutva. The tragedy for many Hindus is that the Hindu nationalists, often ironically referred to by their critics as bucks, the devout, are betraying daily the values of the very faith to which they claim to be committed. Since the original Bhakti movement began in Tamil Nadu in the 6th century, Hindu thought has stressed the personal nature of religion and emphasized the inclusive philosophy and all-embracing syncretism of the faith that Adi Shankara and Vivekananda taught to the world as Hinduism. The traditional Hindu texts, starting with the Vedas, were imbued with a sense of philosophical wonder, raising questions about creation, the nature of being and the meaning of life, and treating nothing as too sacred to interrogate. It is an act of treason to Hinduism to take this faith of mystery and doubt and reduce it to brazen certitudes, to shun diversity and extol dogma and to claim that it is the only authentic Hinduism. The political project of Hindutva is nothing less than an assault on the religion, but where Hinduism has for millennia proved its resilience to external attacks, it is now revealing its vulnerability to attack from within. That is why Hindutva politics must be resisted. In presenting a view of Hinduism that is at odds with everything Hinduism has sought to stand for, it seeks to refashion Hinduism as something it has never been. Indeed, as the economist Kaushik Basu has argued, it reveals the insecurity of Hindutva's cheerleaders that they want to remake their country and religion in the very image of the countries and religions they claim to detest. Hinduism attaches importance to pramana, instruments of warranted inference, in the pursuit of jnana, or knowledge. As long as you can demonstrate the validity or rigor of your pramana, you are entitled to the specific belief structure you wish to adhere to. It is this feature, unlike other traditions that rely on revelation as claims to truth, that ensures Hinduism is more open to diversity of belief. My friend Kirthik Sasidharan suggested to me, in 21st century terms, that Hinduism is analogous to an open-source operating system on top of which others can build applications to be deployed in the receptive hardware of human brains. All Hinduism demands before the formation of any belief is analytical and logical consistency. Even the existence of God is subject to this test. The Nietzschean formulation that God created man and man returned the compliment is anticipated more than a millennium ago in this verse by Udyanacharya, the 10th century logician, addressed to the deity Jagnanatha of Puri. You're so drunk on wealth and power, that you ignore my presence. Just wait, when the Buddhists come, your whole existence depends on me. 6. Yet it should be said that Udyanacharya is the very sage credited with so roundly trouncing Buddhists in debate that Buddhism never dared to challenge Hinduism in India thereafter, a religion without fundamentals. When I stood for the post of UN Secretary General in 2006, journalists quizzed me about the role my Hindu faith played in my worldview. I conceded that it was true that faith can influence one's conduct in one's career and life. For some, it is merely a question of faith in themselves. For others, including me, that sense of faith emerges from a faith in something larger than ourselves. Faith is, at some level, what gives you the courage to take the risks you must take, and enables you to make peace with yourself when you suffer the inevitable setbacks and calumnies that are the lot of those who try to make a difference in the world. So I had no difficulty in saying openly that I am a believing Hindu. But I was also quick to explain what that phrase means to me. I'm not a Hindu fundamentalist. As I have explained in this book, and said often in the past, the fundamental thing about Hinduism is that it is a religion without fundamentals. My faith in global diversity emerges from my Hindu beliefs as well, since we have an extraordinary diversity of religious practices within Hinduism, a faith with no single sacred book but many. Mine is a faith that allows each believer to reach out his or her hands to his or her notion of the Godhead. I was brought up in the belief that all ways of worship are equally valid. I relished pointing out that my father prayed devoutly every day, but never used to oblige me to join him. In the Hindu way, he wanted me to find my own truth. And that was precisely the manner in which I brought up my own sons. Finding my own truth gave me a truth that admits of the possibility that there might be other truths. I therefore bring to the world an attitude that is open, accommodating, and tolerant of others' beliefs. Mine is not a faith for those who seek unquestioning dogmas, but there is no better belief system for an era of doubt and uncertainty than a religion that cheerfully accommodates both. The misuse of religion for political purposes is of course a sad, sometimes tragic, aspect of our contemporary reality. As UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, the problem is never with the faith, but with the faithful. All faiths strive sincerely to animate the divine spark in each of us, but some of their followers, alas, use their faith as a club to beat others with, rather than a platform to raise themselves to the heavens. Since Hinduism believes that there are various ways of reaching the ultimate truth, as a Hindu I fully accepted the belief systems of others as equal to my own. That is why I cannot and do not accept the Hindutva fanatics' interpretation of the values and principles of my faith. But what does it mean to me to be a practicing Hindu? As I mentioned above, I have never been a frequent visitor to temples, though I do believe in praying every day, even if only for a couple of minutes. Many Hindus who can afford the space have a place for puja within their homes, at minimum, a picture, a little statue, or several. I too have maintained a little puja alcove at my homes where I try to reach out to the divine spirit. Yet, I believe in the Upanishad doctrine that the divine is essentially unknowable and unattainable by ordinary mortals. All prayer is an attempt to reach out to that which we cannot touch. While I do occasionally visit temples, and I appreciate how important they are to my mother and most other devout Hindus, I believe that one does not need any intermediaries between oneself and one's notion of the divine. If God is in your heart, it matters little where else he resides. So I take pride in the openness, the diversity, the range, the sublime philosophical aspirations of the Vedanta. I cherish the diversity, the lack of compulsion, and the richness of the various ways in which Hinduism is practiced eclectically. And I admire the civilizational heritage of tolerance that makes Hindu societies open their arms to people of every other faith, to come and practice their beliefs in peace amidst Hindus. It is remarkable, for instance, that the only country on earth where the Jewish people have lived for centuries and never experienced a single episode of anti-Semitism is India. That is the Hinduism in which I gladly take pride. Hinduism's suitability for the modern world lies in many ways in its recognition of uncertainty and its pragmatic non-dogmatism. The religion of maybe he does not know is a faith for the non-dogmatic, one which looks beyond the blacks and whites, the grim certitudes of lesser mortals, to the acknowledgement of the scope for doubt, for different points of view on the great questions of life and death. Vivekananda's immortal we believe not only in universal toleration but we accept all religions as true is a prescription for peace and coexistence among competing dogmatisms in a world full of too many dogmas. This is why it was perhaps the ideal faith for a candidate for United Nations Secretary General to profess. And when I lost the race, my faith offered me consolation too, in the Bhagavad Gita's dictum that one did what was one's dharma to do, regardless of the consequences. Hinduism does not see the world in terms of absolutes. Blacks and whites are largely absent from its ethos. It sees competing notions of good and evil, duty and betrayal, everywhere, and seeks wisdom in finding the right approach suited for each specific circumstance. Vivekananda used to tell a parable of the frog in the well. I am a Hindu. I am sitting in my own little well and thinking that the whole world is my little well. The Christians sit in their little well and think the whole world is their well. The Muslims sit in their little well and think that is the whole world. To Vivekananda, the world was one where each frog had much to learn from the others, if he would only look beyond his well. Hinduism is not a totalizing belief system, it offers a way of coping with the complexity of the world. It acknowledges that the truth is plural, that there is no one correct answer to the big questions of creation, or of the meaning of life. In its reverence for sages and rishis, it admits that knowledge may come from an exchange between two or more views, neither of which necessarily possesses a monopoly on the truth. The greatest truth, to the Hindu, is that which accepts the existence of other truths. Hinduism sees life as an evolving dynamic, not a contest that can ever be settled once and for all. It is open to negotiation on ways of being and believing, it permits negotiation even with God. It offers rites and rituals, but leaves it up to each individual to choose which ones he wishes to adhere to. Each Hindu must find his own truth. Each individual achieves his own salvation and self-fulfillment. At the same time, Hinduism is also anchored in the real world. A superficial view of Hinduism sees its otherworldly timelessness. But in fact the religion is anchored not in a world-denying spirituality, as Raymond Panikar points out, in his words, it is not the timeless, but the timeful, which wins Vedic approbation. Time is depicted in hymns in the Atharva Veda as perpetually replenishing itself from a full vessel which, in spite of all efforts, can never be emptied. Since time transcends time, it is without beginning or end, without limit, and in that sense it is like God. Time am I, world-destroying, says Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, stressing I am imperishable time. As a verse in the Maitreya Upanishad puts it, from time all beings emerge, from time they advance and grow, in time, too, they come to rest. Time is embodied and also bodiless. The harm religion does when it is passionately self-righteous wars, crusades, communal violence, jihad is arguably greater than the benefits religion produces when it does well, teaching morality, answering prayers, providing balm to troubled souls. In its long history, Hinduism has never launched an apocalyptic war of religion or tried to impose one correct answer on all of life. Hindus like to speak of theirs as a religion of peace, but then so do other faiths. Still, the Hindu scriptures are replete with hymns to peace, and are infused with the idea that human beings must seek peace within themselves and peace with all other human beings. Many Vedic mantras set out to achieve these ends. Of these the Shanti mantra is the most famous, and prays for peace in heaven, on earth, and in the human heart. The words Om Shanti, Shanti, Shantihi, are uttered 3 times at the end of every sacred action or after the recitation of a sacred text 3 times because the Hindu seeks peace in all 3 realms. Humans cannot enjoy personal peace in the absence of peace on earth, but equally there cannot be peace in the world if there is no peace in the inner hearts of the human beings in the world. A verse of the Ajur Veda, 30:17, chants, "To the heavens be peace, to the sky and the earth, to the waters be peace, to plants and all trees, to the gods be peace, to Brahman be peace, to all men be peace, again and again peace also to me." 7. The Speaker of the 16th Lok Sabha, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, the first in that office from the BJP, introduced the practice of uttering Om Shanti. Shanti. Shanti, after the otherwise ritualistic reading of obituary notices during each session. Though this implied the introduction of religious language into a secular parliament, her words were echoed by many MPs, and not only those of her party. While as a liberal I was initially dismayed by her doing this, I soon came around to the view that as long as no one was obliged to follow her, calling for peace was hardly objectionable. A Hindu could be overtly Hindu, I felt, if in the process she was being all-embracing in her expression of her faith, while not imposing it on others. Hinduism is a life-affirming religion of joy and play, Leela. It sees the world as suffused with radiance rather than darkness, as the Bhagavad Gita says, that splendor which is from the sun, which illumines this whole world, which is in the moon and in fire, know that splendor is also mine. In turn this refulgence is man's, since he is enjoined by the Upanishads to see all beings in himself and himself in all things, he therefore radiates in his person the splendor of the universe. Yes, the Hindu scriptures acknowledge the existence of human sorrow and suffering, but see them as part of an awakening to the transcendent. The Vedas do not ask why we suffer, they take human sorrow as a given, an affliction to be dealt with and overcome. The Upanishads are more questioning of suffering. They use a word, dukkha, sadness, and existential distress, a word not found in the Vedas. Ideally one must be detached from such suffering, as the Gita teaches, and by eliminating sorrow in oneself through self-realization, help remove it from others. This seems impossible for most ordinary people, and so the easier solution is to take refuge in the Lord. Similarly, the Hindu scriptures speculate about the mystery of what lies beyond human life, but they are not obsessed with death. As Panikkar brilliantly put it, they seem to describe an existential attitude that takes cognizance of the phenomenon of death but denies to it any character of ultimacy. It is by integrating the fact of death into life, by reabsorbing, as it were, death into life, by finding a ground that is common to both death and life, that we can find the proper Vedic perspective. This notion of the continuity between life and death is a particularly Hindu idea, with death, as it were, inbuilt into life. Panikkar again, the beyond is the unfathomable ocean which makes the beaches on this side worth walking and playing on. Hindus believe that, at most, religion can create a platform upon which the beautiful things in life can be attained. Destiny, knowledge, reflection, and prayer may equip you to achieve fulfillment. The Hindu is a seeker, but the Holy Grail he seeks is within himself. Hinduism urges you to explore your own mind and heart to discover the truths about life. The model of the ideal questing Hindu may be found in a description of the sage Narada in the Valmiki Ramayana, dedicated to self-learning, fully in control of the senses, seeker of the truth. Yoga, meditation, prayer, social service are all means to that end, but not the only ones. You have to work hard yourself to achieve those things that are worth achieving. The doctrine of karma yoga preached by both Vivekananda and Mahatma Gandhi is a doctrine of action, not of passivity or fatalism. There is no lassitude in the pursuit of the Purusharthas. The wise Hindu can hold two or more opposing ideas together in her mind at the same time. That is the way the world is. For the Hindu texts uniquely operate from a platform of skepticism, not a springboard of certitude. The Rig Veda verse that says maybe he does not know about the Creator is not an invention of postmodernism, but the wisdom of a timeless text that has lasted for 3.5 millennia and will always be valid. Most faiths prioritize one identity, one narrative, and one holy book. Hinduism recognizes that everyone has multiple identities, accepts diverse narratives and respects several sacred books. Indeed, the folk Hinduism of multiple beliefs cannot be forced into the Abrahamic framework of one book, one deity, and one way of doing things. The more the Hindu grapples with the great questions, the more she understands how much is beyond our understanding. Yet the Hindu lives in reality, in the here and now, conscious that on the way to renunciation and liberation from the world, there are worldly duties and responsibilities to family, community, and nation that must be performed without regard to their rewards. Hindus do not shelter from the besieging forces of life behind the safety of their doctrinal battlements, the omniscience of their dogmas, the fatwas, or encyclicals of their priests. They are unafraid to face the cross-currents, acknowledging how little they know. Indeed, Hindus are not awed by the complexity of the world, because they accept the world is complex, and much passes their understanding, a religion for the 21st century. In the 21st century, Hinduism has many of the attributes of a universal religion, a religion that is personal and individualistic, privileges the individual and does not subordinate one to a collectivity, a religion that grants and respects complete freedom to the believer to find his or her own answers to the true meaning of life, a religion that offers a wide range of choice in religious practice, even in regard to the nature and form of the formless God, a religion that places great emphasis on one's mind, and values one's capacity for reflection, intellectual inquiry, and self-study, a religion that distances itself from dogma and holy writ, that is minimally prescriptive and yet offers an abundance of options, spiritual and philosophical texts and social and cultural practices to choose from. In a world where resistance to authority is growing, Hinduism imposes no authorities. In a world of networked individuals, Hinduism proposes no institutional hierarchies. In a world of open-source information sharing, Hinduism accepts all paths as equally valid. In a world of rapid transformations and accelerating change, Hinduism is adaptable and flexible, which is why it has survived for nearly 4,000 years. In 1926, Professor Clement Webb suggested that Hinduism, with its tradition of openness, tolerance, and acceptance of the divine in the most diverse forms imaginable, could perhaps more easily than any other faith develop, without loss of continuity with its past, into a universal religion. This remains true almost a century later. Universalism comes easily to Hinduism. Hindus respect the environment because it embodies the unity of all creation, and in this, too, theirs is a faith for the 21st century. Dr. Karan Singh, the former Maharaja of Kashmir and Indian politician who is also a superbly readable scholar of Hindu philosophy, identifies 5 major principles in Hinduism that lend relevance and validity to the faith in today's world. At the risk of inadequate paraphrase, these are, according to him, the recognition of the unity of all mankind, epitomized in the Rig Vedic phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, the harmony of all religions, epitomized in that Rig Vedic statement that was Swami Vivekananda's favorite, Ekam Sat Viprabhahadhavanti, the divinity inherent in each individual, transcending the social stratifications and hierarchies that have all too often distorted this principle in Hindu society, the creative synthesis of practical action and contemplative knowledge, science, and religion, meditation and social service, in the faith, and finally, the cosmic vision of Hindu philosophy, incorporating the infinite galaxies of which the Earth is just a tiny speck. In Dr. Singh's own words, such is the grandeur and mystery of the Atman that it can move towards a comprehension of the unutterable mystery of existence. We, who are children of the past and the future, of earth and heaven, of light and darkness, of the human and the divine, at once evanescent and eternal, of the world and beyond it, within time and in eternity, yet have the capacity to comprehend our condition, to rise above our terrestrial limitations, and finally, to transcend the throbbing abyss of space and time itself. This, Dr. Singh says, is the message of Hinduism, and it is a message that can and should resonate throughout the world. Yet such a universal creed can only be the Hinduism described in this book, rather than the petty intolerant Hindutva being propagated by bigots in a travesty of the majesty of their faith. Swami Vivekananda had, as usual, put it best. If there is ever to be a universal religion, it must be one which will have no location in place or time, which will be infinite like the God it will preach, and whose sun will shine upon the followers of Krishna and of Christ, on saints and sinners alike, which will not be Brahminic or Buddhistic, Christian or Mohammedan, but the sum total of all these, and still have infinite space for development, which in its Catholicity will embrace in infinite arms, and find a place for every human being. From the lowest groveling savage, not far removed from the brute, to the highest man towering by the virtues of his head and heart almost above humanity, making society stand in awe of him and doubt his human nature. It will be a religion which will have no place for persecution or intolerance in its polity, which will recognize divinity in every man and woman, and whose whole scope, whose whole force, will be centered in aiding humanity to realize its own true, divine nature. Offer such a religion and all the nations will follow you. I am a Hindu who is proud to offer such a religion to the world. I do so conscious that Hinduism does not seek to proselytize, only to offer itself as an example that others may or may not choose to follow. Unlike the Abrahamic faiths, it manifests no desire to universalize itself, yet its tenets and values are universally applicable. But first it must be revived and reasserted, in its glorious liberalism, its openness and acceptance, its eclecticism and universalism, in the land of its own birth. As the Hindu hymn, from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, says, in words that resonate with meaning for every human being on the planet, Asato ma sad gamaya, Tamaso ma jhatir gamaya, Mritir ma amritam gamaya, led me from untruth to truth, led me from darkness to light, led me from death to immortality. Notes. Preface.